Once, they ruled with swords. Today, their bloodlines still walk among us, moving quietly through modern cities where steel towers have replaced wooden castles and power no longer hangs at the edge of a blade. For centuries, their presence shaped the destiny of a nation, enforcing loyalty, commanding armies, and living by a code that valued honor above life itself. Their names were spoken with fear, respect, and sometimes resentment, because they stood between chaos and control. Then, almost without warning, the world they knew began to dissolve, and the privileges that defined them were stripped away by a rapidly modernizing state. The swords were banned, the hairstyles cut, and the warrior class was told to step aside. History often tells us that they vanished, folded neatly into textbooks and museum displays, frozen in armor behind glass. Yet blood does not disappear when a system collapses, and identity does not dissolve simply because a title is revoked. Some say the samurai died with the old era, buried beneath reform and revolution. Others believe they adapted, reshaping their discipline and influence into forms less visible but no less powerful. Did they truly disappear, or did they transform into something the modern world would never recognize as the descendants of warriors? The samurai were the military nobility of feudal Japan, a disciplined warrior class that rose to prominence during centuries of political fragmentation and regional conflict. They served powerful lords known as daimyo, functioning as armed retainers responsible for protection, enforcement, and territorial control. Unlike common foot soldiers, samurai occupied a privileged social rank positioned above farmers, artisans, and merchants within a rigid hierarchical system. Their authority was recognized not only through weaponry, but through hereditary status, stipends, and formal recognition within the governing structure of their domains. Their primary duty was warfare, yet their responsibilities extended far beyond the battlefield into governance and administration. During extended periods of peace, many samurai transitioned into bureaucrats, managing taxation, infrastructure, and legal matters within castle towns and provincial regions. Central to their identity was a moral framework later known as Bushido, a code emphasizing loyalty, discipline, courage, and unwavering obedience to one's lord. This ethical system shaped both their conduct in combat and their daily behavior within society, reinforcing cohesion within the warrior class. Samurai were trained from childhood in martial skills such as archery, swordsmanship, and horseback combat, alongside education in literature and strategy. Mastery of both physical and intellectual disciplines distinguished them from lower-ranking fighters and reinforced their elite status. Although predominantly male, the samurai class also included women born into warrior families who were trained to defend their households when necessary. These women, sometimes referred to as onabugeisha, were instructed in the use of weapons and expected to uphold clan honor. Residence patterns reflected their rank, as samurai typically lived in designated districts surrounding their lord's castle rather than in isolated temples or mountain retreats. Their proximity to political authority underscored their integration into governance rather than separation from society. In essence, the samurai were not merely warriors but a ruling military aristocracy embedded within the fabric of Japan's feudal state. Their influence combined armed power, administrative authority, and inherited prestige into a unified system of control. The samurai class began to take shape in the 10th century during the late Heian period, when Japan's central imperial court gradually lost effective control over distant provinces. As authority weakened in the capital, power began shifting toward regional landholders who required armed protection. Communication across mountainous terrain was slow, and the court lacked the military infrastructure to enforce order in remote territories. Wealthy estate owners therefore recruited skilled fighters to defend farmland, collect taxes, and suppress uprisings beyond the immediate reach of imperial officials. These early warriors were not yet a formal class, but disciplined retainers bound by personal loyalty to local lords. Their value rested on their combat skill, horsemanship, and ability to respond quickly to threats in a decentralized political landscape. As rival clans competed for land and influence, violence became an increasingly common method of resolving disputes. Military strength translated directly into political leverage, allowing successful commanders to secure territory and expand their authority beyond simple estate protection. Over time, these armed networks grew more organized, forming structured hierarchies with defined obligations and rewards. Loyalty was exchanged for stipends, land rights, and elevated social status, gradually separating warriors from farmers and laborers within society. By the 12th century, military families such as the Taira and Minamoto had risen to national prominence through sustained conflict. Their victories shifted real governing power away from the imperial court and toward a warrior-led administration. This transition culminated in the establishment of the first shogunate, institutionalizing samurai leadership over the state, while the emperor remained a symbolic figure. What began as a response to insecurity had matured into a political system centered on hereditary military authority. The birth of the samurai was therefore not a romantic emergence of noble warriors, but a structural adaptation to governmental weakness. In the absence of centralized control, armed protectors became rulers, embedding martial service into the foundation of Japan's feudal order. At the center of samurai identity stood an ethical framework later known as Bushido, a moral code that emphasized loyalty, discipline, courage, and personal honor above individual desire. This code functioned as both spiritual compass and social contract, binding warriors to their lords through absolute obligation. Honor was not symbolic within this system, but enforceable through expectation and consequence, shaping decisions in war and governance alike. A samurai's reputation determined his standing, and dishonor could erase generations of carefully preserved family prestige. The class was overwhelmingly male in leadership and battlefield command, reflecting the patriarchal structure of feudal society. Yet women born into samurai families were trained in weapon use and household defense, ensuring continuity of protection when men were absent. These women, often associated with the Naginata polearm, were responsible for defending estates during sieges or internal conflict. Their participation reinforced the idea that loyalty and martial readiness extended beyond gender, though authority remained male-dominated. Marriage within the samurai class was strongly encouraged to preserve alliances, property rights, and hereditary status. Unions were frequently arranged to strengthen political ties between clans, reinforcing networks of power through bloodline consolidation. The hereditary system formalized succession, passing rank, stipends, and obligations from father to son across generations. Social mobility into the class became increasingly restricted over time, solidifying the samurai as a closed aristocratic order. Unlike ascetic monks who withdrew into mountains or temple complexes, samurai resided in structured castle towns near their lords. Their proximity to administrative centers reflected their dual role as warriors and governing officials embedded within daily political life. Through Bushido, controlled marriage alliances, and inherited privilege, the samurai maintained internal cohesion and external authority. Honor regulated behavior, lineage preserved power, and geography anchored them firmly within the machinery of the feudal state. What happens when a ruling warrior class suddenly loses its swords? What remains of identity when the symbol that defined power for centuries is taken away in a single political decision? The Meiji Restoration dismantled the feudal order and centralized authority under a modern imperial state determined to industrialize rapidly. In this sweeping transformation, the samurai class was formally abolished as Japan restructured itself to compete with Western powers. Stipends that had sustained samurai families for generations were terminated, severing the economic backbone of hereditary service. Privileges that once separated them from commoners vanished within a decade of aggressive reform. The right to carry swords in public, once the unmistakable marker of status, was legally banned under the Heitoriai Edict. Blades that symbolized authority were reduced to private relics, stripped of their political function. The traditional top-knot hairstyle, another visible emblem of class distinction, was discouraged and gradually disappeared. The outward appearance of the samurai dissolved into the anonymity of modern civilian life. Many former warriors were compelled to seek new professions in administration, education, commerce, or the emerging national military. Adaptation became survival, replacing inherited rank with competitive merit within a modernizing economy. Some resisted the reforms, culminating in uprisings such as the Satsuma Rebellion led by disaffected former samurai. These conflicts underscored the emotional rupture between feudal loyalty and national modernization. For generations raised to equate honor with service to a feudal lord, the psychological displacement was profound. Identity had been anchored in duty, and duty had suddenly been reassigned to a nation-state rather than a clan. The transformation did not erase their bloodlines, but it dismantled their institutional authority with remarkable speed. Within a single generation, a warrior aristocracy became citizens of a constitutional empire. This moment represents the emotional fracture point in samurai history, where continuity was interrupted yet not extinguished. The swords were surrendered, but the discipline, education, and networks cultivated over centuries would quietly migrate into new forms of influence. The collapse did not arrive as a slow fading, but as a sharp severing of rank, privilege, and identity. Men raised to command suddenly found themselves standing equal among those they once governed. Government stipends were eliminated, leaving many former samurai families financially destabilized for the first time in generations. The security of hereditary income vanished, forcing proud lineages into unfamiliar economic uncertainty. Some could not accept the erasure of their class and chose open resistance against the new imperial order. Their rebellions were fueled not only by politics, but by grief for a world that had defined their existence. Others made a colder calculation and redirected their discipline into emerging institutions of the modern state. They entered bureaucratic offices, classrooms, and the reorganized national army with the same rigid sense of duty. The sword was no longer their authority, but education became their new weapon of survival. Literacy and administrative experience allowed many to transition into leadership within the transforming society. Family names that once carried military prestige were quietly preserved within civil service and commerce. Influence shifted from battlefield command to strategic participation in modernization. The fall, therefore, was not uniform collapse but divergence under pressure. One path burned in defiance, while the other reshaped itself to endure. In losing their visible power, the descendants of the samurai entered a new era of concealed influence. Their status disappeared, yet their discipline migrated into the foundations of modern Japan. Power did not evaporate when the swords were surrendered, it migrated into quieter rooms. Influence moved from open battlefields into chambers where decisions shaped a nation's future without the clash of steel. Former samurai entered the newly structured imperial military, carrying discipline into a centralized national force. Their familiarity with hierarchy and strategy positioned them naturally within officer ranks of the modern army and navy. Others transitioned into government administration, drafting policies instead of war plans. Bureaucratic leadership became the new arena where loyalty and order were exercised with pens rather than blades. Education emerged as another channel of authority, as samurai-descended families invested heavily in scholarship. Universities and civil examinations replaced hereditary privilege with credentialed merit, yet preparation often favored those with disciplined lineage. In commerce, some lineages leveraged networks formed during feudal service to build early industrial enterprises. The habits of resource management and regional oversight translated into executive capability within expanding corporations. Political life also absorbed former warrior bloodlines, especially during Japan's early constitutional period. Familiarity with governance at the domain level evolved into participation within national legislative structures. The transformation was subtle but strategic, embedding inherited discipline inside modern institutions. Authority became less visible, yet more structurally integrated into state and economy. Several prominent families in contemporary Japan trace their ancestry to samurai retainers or domain officials. Genealogical continuity does not grant formal privilege today, but historical memory still shapes social identity. Cultural capital replaced feudal entitlement as the enduring inheritance of warrior descent. Prestige now rests on education, public service, and professional achievement rather than martial exclusivity. The redistribution of samurai power demonstrates adaptation rather than disappearance. What once commanded through presence on horseback now operates through policy, enterprise, and institutional leadership. Their authority did not end with the ban on swords. It recalibrated within a modern framework. The warrior class dissolved as a category, yet fragments of its influence continue to circulate through contemporary systems of governance and business. The samurai no longer exist as a legal class within modern Japan. Their social rank was formally abolished, ending the warrior hierarchy that once structured the nation. Yet the bloodlines did not disappear when the titles were removed. Descendant families still carry genealogies that trace their ancestry back to feudal retainers and domain officials. Today, samurai identity survives primarily through cultural preservation rather than political authority. Heritage associations, restored castles, and archived clan records sustain historical continuity. Traditional martial arts, such as kendo and aikido, preserve elements of warrior discipline within structured practice. These systems function as cultural education rather than preparation for combat. Annual festivals in former castle towns sometimes include ceremonial reenactments of feudal processions. Such events honor regional history without restoring hereditary privilege. Modern Japanese society operates without a warrior class or legal aristocracy. Samurai therefore exist as historical descendants and cultural memory, not as a governing order. Each year, former castle towns awaken to the measured rhythm of ceremonial drums. Streets that once carried armored retainers now host annual parades designed to reconstruct the visual grandeur of a warrior past. Participants move in formation wearing lacquered helmets and layered silk robes modeled after feudal armor. The choreography is deliberate, transforming public space into a staged corridor of historical memory. Banners marked with ancient clan crests rise above the crowd in disciplined symmetry. The imagery recreates authority through color and movement rather than through command. Foreign visitors line the sidewalks, cameras lifted toward the spectacle. Tourism agencies frame these reenactments as immersive encounters with Japan's martial heritage. Local governments support restoration of gates, stone walls, and moats to anchor the performance in authentic surroundings. Architecture reinforces the illusion of temporal return. Merchants sell replica swords, miniature armor, and printed crests near the procession routes. Commercial exchange becomes intertwined with historical representation. Schools organize student attendance as part of cultural education programs. The events are presented as preservation of history rather than revival of hierarchy. Despite the armor and marching formations, no governing power accompanies the display. The swords remain symbolic artifacts within a democratic society. These festivals therefore operate as custodians of memory, not instruments of rule. The warrior image survives in ceremony, sustained by identity and global curiosity rather than political control. The swords are gone, yet the discipline remains embedded within the bloodlines of descendants. Where once loyalty was pledged to a feudal lord, it now manifests in dedication to corporations, institutions, and societal roles demanding precision and honor. Many samurai descendants occupy positions of leadership in government, business, and the military. Their historical training in strategy, hierarchy, and ritualized decision-making translates seamlessly into executive planning and administrative authority. Education became a battlefield where modern samurai prove their worth. Mastery of knowledge and intellectual rigor replaces martial skill, sustaining influence without the display of weaponry or armor. Corporate loyalty often mirrors clan allegiance, emphasizing discipline, teamwork, and strategic foresight. Descendants leverage ancestral networks, blending inherited cultural capital with professional expertise to maintain subtle yet effective influence. Some families preserve ceremonial traditions in private homes, martial arts dojos, and cultural societies. These practices reinforce identity, honor heritage, and transmit values to new generations without asserting formal power. Philanthropy, cultural sponsorship, and participation in public institutions extend the samurai legacy into modern civic life. Influence flows quietly, guided by principles learned in an era of swords and top knots. Global awareness amplifies this hidden authority as the samurai image circulates through media, tourism, and storytelling. The mystique of discipline, honor, and strategic intelligence attracts curiosity and admiration worldwide. Even in urban landscapes dominated by skyscrapers and technology, the ethos of the samurai persists. Descendants act as living bridges between Japan's historical order and the demands of contemporary society. Ultimately, the modern samurai demonstrates that power and legacy need not be tied to visible symbols. Influence survives through discipline, education, cultural stewardship, and the silent transmission of values across generations. Did the samurai truly disappear, or did they evolve into forms the modern world can barely recognize? The swords may be gone, but the legacy of discipline, strategy, and loyalty continues to ripple quietly through families and institutions. What we witness in festivals, martial arts schools, and corporate leadership is not a revival of feudal power, but a transformation of influence into subtle, structured, and enduring forms. Their authority has shifted from visible command to cultural and social impact. Every parade, reenactment, and preserved sword serves as a reminder that heritage is not merely nostalgia. It is an active force shaping identity, values, and conduct even centuries after the class itself vanished. The descendants of samurai carry a silent power, expressed through education, professional achievement, and civic engagement. Their influence is rarely overt, yet its effects permeate aspects of modern Japanese society, from government halls to corporate boardrooms. History teaches that the structures we think permanent are often malleable. Power, once tangible and violent, can migrate into culture, ritual, and intellect, continuing its effect without swords or crowns. Reflection invites us to consider our own society. How do values, training, and legacy translate into influence when traditional symbols of authority are removed? What happens when power changes form but continues to operate? Through the lens of the samurai, we see that identity and discipline can survive systemic upheaval. They adapt, persist, and manifest in ways that modern observers might never immediately recognize. Asia Eye Within celebrates this continuity of influence and invites viewers to ponder the unseen forces shaping the world today. Heritage, though transformed, remains a living, breathing guide to action and aspiration. If this journey into history, transformation, and modern identity inspired you, like, subscribe, and comment. Share your reflections on how legacies persist, evolve, and silently shape society.